Good morning. I'm Nova Blake, and this is your complete political briefing for Thursday, April 16th, 2026. Today, the United States Senate blocks a war powers vote on Iran as the Trump administration escalates to financial warfare, threatening secondary sanctions against China and the world. Let's get into it. But before we do, please subscribe to this channel to watch our daily bulletin every morning at 6 a.m. Starting with the top stories from across the American political landscape, the Republican-led Senate blocked yet another Democratic effort to limit President Trump's war powers in Iran on Wednesday, April 15th, voting 47-52 along almost entirely party lines to reject a resolution that would require congressional authorization before the conflict continues. It was the fourth time this year the Senate has rejected a war powers measure on Iran, and the first vote since Trump threatened to destroy an entire civilization if Iran did not reopen the Strait of Hormuz. Only Senator Rand Paul of Kentucky voted with Democrats in favor. With the war now approaching its 47th day, the stakes are rising sharply. Under the 1973 War Powers Resolution, Congress must formally authorize the military action by April 29th, the 60-day mark, or Trump would be legally required to begin withdrawing forces. The Justice Department filed motions in federal court on Tuesday, April 14th, asking a federal appeals court to completely erase the seditious conspiracy convictions of 12 leaders of the Proud Boys and Oath Keepers for their roles in the January 6th, 2021 attack on the United States Capitol. The filing, submitted by United States Attorney for the District of Columbia, Jeanine Pirro, asks the court to vacate the convictions with prejudice, meaning the cases could never be brought again. Among those whose convictions the government is now seeking to wipe out is Oath Keepers founder Stewart Rhodes, who had been sentenced to 18 years in federal prison, and multiple Proud Boys leaders including Ethan Nordine, Joseph Biggs, and Zachary Rell, all of whom had previously had their prison sentences commuted by President Trump, but had retained their felony convictions. President Trump escalated his confrontation with Federal Reserve Chair Jerome Powell on Wednesday, explicitly threatening to fire him if he does not vacate his position when his term expires on May 15th. Speaking on Fox Business, Trump said Powell is doing a bad job, should be lowering interest rates, and would be fired if he did not leave on time. Powell's term as chairman expires in 30 days, but his nominated replacement, former Federal Reserve Governor Kevin Warsh, has not yet had a Senate confirmation hearing. Senator Thom Tillis of North Carolina, a Republican, has also said he will block Warsh's confirmation until the Department of Justice drops a criminal probe into Powell over renovations at the Federal Reserve's headquarters, complicating the administration's stated goal of installing Warsh by mid-May. Pakistan's Army Chief, Field Marshal Asim Munir, the key diplomatic interlocutor between the United States and Iran, arrived in Tehran on Wednesday for direct meetings with Iranian officials, including Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi, in the most tangible diplomatic signal yet that a second round of peace talks is actively being pursued. President Trump told reporters Tuesday he expects the talks to resume in Pakistan within the next 2 days, and the White House said Wednesday it feels good about the prospects of a deal. However, the central sticking point remains unresolved. The United States proposed a 20-year halt to Iranian nuclear enrichment, while Iran countered with a 3 to 5 year suspension, a gap that caused the previous Islamabad talks to collapse. The United States is deploying more than 10,000 additional troops to the Middle East before the end of April, even as a fragile 2-week ceasefire with Iran technically remains in effect. According to defense officials, approximately 6,000 troops are being sent aboard the aircraft carrier USS George H.W. Bush and its escort ships, with another 4,200 Marines from the Boxer Amphibious Ready Group expected to arrive in the region by month's end. United States Central Command, or CENTCOM, reported that in the first 24 hours of the naval blockade of Iranian ports, no ships successfully entered or exited Iranian ports, and 6 merchant vessels were ordered to turn around and complied. The blockade currently involves more than 10,000 troops, over 100 aircraft, and more than 12 warships. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent announced Wednesday, April 15th, that the United States is preparing what he described as the financial equivalent of a bombing campaign against Iran, including secondary sanctions against any country, company, or financial institution doing business with Iran. Bessent confirmed that 2 Chinese banks have already received formal warnings about handling Iranian money, and that the Treasury Department sent letters to financial institutions in China, Hong Kong, the United Arab Emirates, and Oman, threatening to levy penalties for allowing Iranian transactions through their financial systems. The announcement represents a major escalation of economic pressure and comes as President Trump is scheduled to travel to Beijing on May 14th and 15th to meet with Chinese President Xi Jinping. The S&P 500 stock index hit a fresh record high on Wednesday, April 15th, climbing above 7,000 points for the first time in history as investors expressed cautious optimism about the Iran ceasefire and the growing prospect of a second round of peace talks. The index rose 0.5% on the day, erasing all losses tied to the Iran war over the previous 2 weeks. Markets have been highly responsive to every diplomatic signal from the Iran ceasefire negotiations, swinging sharply with each development in the war, and analysts cautioned that the record close could quickly reverse if the 2-week ceasefire, set to expire on April 22nd, is not extended or replaced by a broader agreement. The House of Representatives postponed a scheduled floor vote on extending Section 702 of the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, or FISA, which is set to expire on April 20th without congressional action. The measure, which allows the United States government to collect electronic communications of foreign nationals overseas without a warrant, faced resistance from conservative Republicans who want reforms before they vote for a renewal, and from Democrats with civil liberties concerns. House Speaker Mike Johnson pulled the procedural vote Wednesday morning, but officials said the legislation could still come to the floor this week as the clock runs out. Multiple congressional committees are hosting cabinet secretaries this week as Congress reviews the administration's fiscal year 2027 budget proposal, which includes the largest defense spending request in United States history at $1.5 trillion, alongside deep cuts to domestic programs. Health and Human Services Secretary Robert F. Kennedy Jr., Agriculture Secretary Brooke Rollins, Energy Secretary Chris Wright, and Office of Management and Budget Director Russ Vought are all scheduled to testify. The hearings are taking place as the DHS shutdown remains unresolved at 60 days, and as lawmakers grapple with the administration's Iran war supplemental funding request, expected to be between $80 billion and $100 billion. Iran's national petrochemical company suspended all exports of petrochemical products on Wednesday until further notice, citing disruptions to domestic supply caused by American and Israeli strikes over the previous 6 weeks. The suspension removes another major category of Iranian exports from global markets at a time when the Strait of Hormuz remains largely blocked and oil prices are hovering near $100 per barrel. The move is expected to further tighten global supply chains for plastics, fertilizers, and other chemicals derived from Iranian petrochemical production, adding to the inflationary pressures already radiating from the conflict across the world economy. Now turning to Washington and the latest actions from the current administration. Here are 10 significant developments from the administration this week. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent announced Wednesday that the United States will impose secondary sanctions against any nation, company, or bank that conducts business with Iran, including American allies. The threat directly targets China, the largest buyer of Iranian crude oil, and comes amid Trump's planned May visit to Beijing. 2 Chinese banks have already been formally warned, and Gulf nations, including the United Arab Emirates, have been told they face penalties if Iranian money continues to flow through their financial systems. Bessent described the move as the financial equivalent of a bombing campaign designed to cut off Iran's ability to fund its military and pay its loyalists. The Trump administration moved Tuesday to permanently erase the seditious conspiracy convictions of 12 prominent January 6th defendants, including Oath Keepers founder Stewart Rhodes and 4 Proud Boys leaders, by asking a federal appeals court to vacate their guilty verdicts with prejudice. The Department of Justice, under United States Attorney Jeanine Pirro, framed the filing as consistent with a prosecutorial discretion decision that continuing these cases is not in the interests of justice. Democrats and civil rights advocates immediately condemned the move as an attempt to rewrite the historical record of the January 6th attack and shield convicted insurrectionists from the legal consequences of seditious conspiracy. President Trump explicitly threatened Wednesday to fire Federal Reserve Chair Jerome Powell on or after May 15th if he does not step down voluntarily when his term expires. The threat to remove Powell, whose independence from presidential pressure is considered a cornerstone of American monetary policy, drew immediate concern from financial economists and market analysts. Trump's nominee to replace Powell, former Federal Reserve Governor Kevin Warsh, has not yet had a Senate confirmation hearing, and his path to confirmation faces a potential obstacle from Senator Thom Tillis, who is blocking the vote until a separate Justice Department criminal investigation into Powell is resolved. The United States Central Command confirmed this week that the naval blockade of Iranian ports, now in its third day, is being enforced by more than 10,000 troops, 12 warships, and over 100 military aircraft. CENTCOM reported that in the first 24 hours, no merchant vessels entered or exited Iranian ports, and 6 ships that attempted to do so were ordered to turn around and complied. The administration simultaneously announced the deployment of an additional 10,000 troops aboard new carrier and amphibious ready group formations headed to the Middle East, expected to arrive before the end of April, and placing the United States in an even stronger position of military pressure around Iran. The administration released a new round of Treasury Department sanctions on Wednesday, targeting more than 24 individuals, companies, and vessels connected to the export of Iranian oil and natural gas, including entities based in China, the United Arab Emirates, and other countries. The sanctions are designed to close off the financial networks that have allowed Iran to continue selling oil in defiance of existing sanctions through what the Treasury Department describes as an elaborate shadow fleet and payment network. The Treasury's Office of Foreign Assets Control, or OFAC, identified the sanctioned entities as part of the administration's escalating economic warfare campaign against Tehran. The White House expressed optimism Wednesday that a second round of direct United States-Iran peace talks will take place imminently, with Pakistan again serving as the likely host. Pakistan's Army Chief and Interior Minister traveled to Tehran on Wednesday to personally persuade the Iranian delegation to return to the table. The ceasefire agreed to on April 8th is set to expire on April 22nd, creating a hard diplomatic deadline for both sides to make progress. Vice President Vance has said he is prepared to lead the American delegation again and described what the administration is seeking as a grand bargain: no nuclear weapon, no state sponsorship of terrorism, and free navigation through the Strait of Hormuz. The Trump administration's push to fire Powell and install Kevin Warsh as Federal Reserve Chair before the May 15th deadline faces significant obstacles. Warsh only recently submitted required financial disclosures to the Senate Banking Committee, pushing back the earliest possible confirmation hearing to the week of April 21st at the earliest. Senator Tillis's hold threatens to block floor consideration entirely unless the Justice Department resolves or drops its criminal probe into Powell. The extraordinary situation, in which the president is simultaneously threatening the departing Fed chair and attempting to rush through his replacement, is being closely watched by international financial markets and foreign central banks. The House of Representatives faces a critical decision this week on Section 702 of FISA, which expires on April 20th. The surveillance authority allows American intelligence agencies to collect electronic communications of foreign nationals abroad and has been a cornerstone of post-September 11th counterterrorism and national security operations. Conservative Republicans want reforms including restrictions on domestic queries of FISA databases, while Democrats are divided between those who want full reform and those who fear leaving the authority to lapse during an active wartime period, with Iran, China, and Russia all conducting elevated cyber attacks against American systems. the administration is managing an increasingly complex diplomatic relationship with Italy after President Trump criticized Italian Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni Tuesday for her public defense of Pope Leo XIV. Meloni had called Trump's attacks on the Pope unacceptable, and Trump told an Italian newspaper that it was Meloni who was unacceptable. Italy subsequently suspended its defense cooperation agreement with Israel, a significant step for one of Washington's key European partners, in what Italian officials described as a principled response to the ongoing war and civilian casualties in Lebanon. The friction with Meloni represents one of the most serious rifts yet between the Trump administration and a European right-wing ally. The DHS shutdown, now 60 days old, remains the longest partial government funding lapse in the department's history. The House has not yet voted on the Senate's bipartisan funding bill, and Republican leaders are navigating competing pressures from the far right of the House Republican Conference, which is demanding full immigration and customs enforcement funding, and from the White House, which wants the shutdown resolved before public anger further damages Republican electoral prospects ahead of the November midterms. Senate Republicans are separately working to advance ICE funding through budget reconciliation by a June 1st deadline, but the process requires a unified Republican coalition in both chambers that has so far proven difficult to assemble. That's your full briefing for Thursday, April 16th, 2026. I'm Nova Blake. Stay informed, stay ahead. We'll see you next time.